Good morning. I'm Leslie Tarkington, and the BET Budget Committee members include Leslie Moriarty, Deborah Hess, and Jeff Raymer. We welcome you to a special meeting to present the first read of the fiscal year 2021-2022 budget guidelines, the first step in the kickoff of the fiscal year 22 budget cycle. Thank you to our IT Zoom and GCTV support team, Jenny Larkin and Horst Tebbe. Since this is a first read, I asked Roland Geiger, the town's budget director, to present the estimate, the summary of the proposed assumptions at this time and expected to be assumptions requested to be used by departments as they prepare their budgets. I expect Pete Minarski, town controller and finance department head, will jump in and elaborate as Roland runs through the estimate. We may want Roland to complete the estimate prior to any committee questions, but I'll leave that up to you. I'll follow the panel, but I think it may be helpful if Roland runs through. And then thereafter, Roland will outline the remainder of the exhibits. I thought that would be helpful. And then we can follow with a brief discussion of highlights from the guidelines document. This is a first read with discussion only at this meeting. So Roland, would you like to bring up the estimate and
So you want to start with the estimate?
well,
Okay.
what would I think that's a good place to start. If you run through the assumptions, and how you put it together, and this has been excellent teamwork, and Pete is here with us too, and has had a lot of input to this. Invaluable input from both. Experience.
Okay, so can you see the screen?
Yes.
Okay. So pretty much everything on the operating side was increased at 2%. The salaries are basically flat year over year. There's some amount in there for increases. There's about $400,000 on the town side above the 2%. And above the flat, and about I think it's about $80,000 on the school side for the regular salaries. And on the teacher's side, we increased that by 3%. Everything else is at 2% through there, except for the 200s in the schools, which were 2% plus 1.6 for special ed. That brings us down to apartment costs. Healthcare, we brought it over at 10%. OPEB, we left pretty much flat. And the pension contribution is $30.5 million, which could go up to, I believe, 31.8. Nathaniel Witherall is the operating contribution is 1.5 million. And the $1 million is to pay off last year's loss.
Roland,
Yes.
you went past the. I apologize for interrupting you, but you went past the risk fund.
Oh,
You or Leslie might want to explain going from 3 to 235.
Or Pete, maybe you had the data. Maybe that would be good for you to add here.
What data?
Well, the risk fund, the numbers. Why it's.
Right. Well, I could tell you. I think you're referring to. We ended June 30th at 1.6. We got 3 million, so we're at 4.6. And the unknown is we need a report at the audit committee meeting. We'll have from town attorney Vincent Marino a report on the potential large cases, and that will be followed up in February before the budget committee on the potential of cases that are going to come between February, the end of this year, and the next 12 months. So what's most important, not only for the CAFR in the budget process, is Vincent Marino's estimate of what's out there. So assuming, which is a bad assumption, that no single case it comes due, you got 4.6 plus this is $6 million. None of the cases that are material, I'm not aware of any of the cases that are material are going to hit with the $3 million SIR, the self-insured retention, also known as the deductible. So that's where we are. We're looking at between now and June 30th, 22, $6 million that's available to pay off legal cases. Is that what you were looking for, Leslie?
Yes, I think actually it's closer to 7, Pete, if you add
see,
2,350,000 to 4.6.
I'm sorry, you're right. It's almost 7 million. Correct.
So I think, as you point out, since there are no pending cases that anyone is aware of with the higher SIRs, or that would be settled in this fiscal year 22, that was why that number was basically felt that the around $7 million was adequate.
So I had some questions on some of these, but I think
Yeah,
orderly would be to come back at the end.
Yeah, I just thought if Roland went through and then,
Yeah, that's right.
then.
I didn't know if we were getting into dialogue on these items.
Only because Pete, stopped Roland there, but if we could just, go back, and then there'll be lots of time for questions, Jeff.
Okay, thank you. But by the way, my apologies to everybody. But as I said, when we set this date up, I have a very hard stop at 10 o'clock. My apologies to everybody.
Pete and I do as well.
And Roland and Pete do. So Jeff, I wasn't even going to mention that because it's a hard stop for all.
Okay, thank you.
So if we go down to school lunch, we have a $150,000 contribution to the operations. And then we're going to cover the loss as of June 30th, 2020, which is 520. The other fixed charges are 2% plus. We increased that by, I believe, 400,000 for insurance that's going up. Which brings us down to.
Hey, Roland, I'm sorry. Just in the 200s on the Board of Ed, you talked about the 2% before, but you didn't mention why that line item went up so much. Maybe you want to highlight that.
2% off of last year's 200s, plus 1.6 million for special ed.
Yes, thank you. I just wanted to make sure that that point was made.
The other, that negative 88,000, that's simply reflecting the benefits for the town and the Board of Ed farther up.
Roland, it's actually 88 million.
For 88, yeah.
Rather than 1,000.
Which brings us down to the capital tax levy. I mean, I don't know what the 40 million, that's simply an adjustment, a plug number basically at this point, but which would normally be a $48 million tax levy, but this model shows using 3 million from the capital non-recurring account, 3 million, which would bring the effective tax levy down to 45.
Roland, can I just identify though, I mean, a big part of that is if you look at the debt service is going down from 45,720 to 41,204.
Right. There's we are
want to
getting rid of
confirm
a
we're having the
$40
discussion.
million.
I'm sorry, Leslie. Sorry. I will keep quiet until he goes through it. Apologize.
Roland, please continue.
Okay, so this brings the use of fund balance 15, which is flat compared to last year, and another $1.5 million, which was, I think, would say just that is to cover Nathaniel Witherall and school lunch prior year losses. Other revenues went up to reflect some collection of grant revenues, which we haven't been budgeting in the past, but we always got something. And this reflects that 49500 minus 46995. So about $2.5 million of grant revenue from whatever sources it is during the year. which brings us down to the mill rate calculation. And speaking to the assessor, the senior tax relief got reduced from 270 to 150, and the tax assessor also said or estimates that the grand list would increase by 0.0, almost 6, which brings us to a mill rate of 1.46% over last year.
So, I'm sorry, Roland. Are you finished, or would you like to add some?
No, these are just assumptions and just to see what this scenario looks like. That's all it is.
So before we start any discussion here, I just wanted to add, Roland commented on the salary accounts, which were, I think this year we've tried to look and present something that is as close to the facts that we know at this point in time. So Roland has actually gone in and looked at salaries. I mean, thank you to the unions that have been negotiating contracts with our labor negotiator for the town. And, we have some flat union contracts for this year, which then makes it, funds available in terms of our budgeting structure to be, flat this year off next year for fiscal year 22 off of fiscal year 21. So this was not a change in anything or really putting anything into changing the labor contracts, but rather reflecting the reality of the support that's coming from our labor unions to get through this period of time that we're all kind of adjusting to, suffering through, and really adapting to in a team-like manner. So I wanted to add that point there in that particular section. Deborah, I think, has emphasized the 200s, the additional money over and above the 2% operating increases. I think, what's new here is also Roland has allocated the benefits out. I think he didn't exactly mention that. He mentioned it down below in fixed charges. This reflects, he did a lot of work to reflect the benefits for the town and the benefits for the town and the school employees. So that reflects that. So you'll see that those costs are about 70% of the total costs within this general fund. And remember, this is the general fund. So we have other revenue funds, which Roland has also referred to here. And so I think the other thing in terms of covering, as Roland said, the losses and in the budget committee decisions in very early March of this current fiscal year, we did fund audited losses of our revenue funds. And these, while the audit isn't complete yet, Pete and Roland have inside information, and they expect that the audited losses for both Witherall and for the school lunch will be approximately the amounts that have been put here. And so we have included that in terms of funding this. And that's another good point. That's another good point to raise. We didn't, in the estimate last year, we didn't put these potential losses in, but since we've now developed a process, we've moved ahead with that. So I just wanted to add those comments. And now, it's open for other discussion, unless Pete or Roland want to add something to my comments.
The only is, Jeff might be first, but I have an answer to Deborah Hess's question about debt service, and I could wait for Jeff to go first. It's up to you, Madam Chair.
Well, as far as I'm concerned, answer Deborah's question, Pete. I mean, it's not my province to say that, but I have no objection to your going first.
Okay, if you could, for others on the outside looking in, the question is centered on the debt service line in the capital tax levy, where it drops from 45.7 to 41.2. There are two pieces. Our last 4 years, we've borrowed $40 million. Most of it's general fund, but 5 years ago, there was a $50 million all general fund bond issue that's falling off. So that's $10 million a year that's falling off to a potentially a much smaller borrowing this year, which at this point right now is $30 million. So the delta between the 30 and the 50 comes out to the $4 million. So that's why, two parts. Number one, we've been trending at 40 million a year. The 5-year-old $50 million bond issue is falling off. It's fully amortized. And then we're going to drop from 40 to a much lower number in the general fund of about 30 million. Is that basically your question, Deborah?
Yeah, I just wanted to highlight that the number that was really driving a part of why that number went down. Hey, Jeff, before I know you have questions, but I guess Roland and Pete, were you planning to go through the rest of the documents first before we actually open for questions, knowing that I actually interrupted and I apologize for that. But were you going to go through any of the other documents?
But I mean, I think the other documents just show how healthcare or how benefit costs are really driving a lot of the budget increases. And that's what Exhibit 2 shows.
And Exhibit 2 is the breakdown that you've used after calculating it for the summary estimate. So this is,
Right.
If someone's asking for the data, this is the breakdown of the benefits by category, healthcare, pension fund, et cetera, et cetera.
And this is again, where we apply the benefits to the 2021 budget. Again, it just shows how much the total cost of benefits are. And this is interesting because it shows, I guess you can't see that, but you can see the total cost per employee as a percent of salary. And you can see the benefit costs is 60, 66, 99, 97. So the benefits are, in some cases, as much as the salaries are. And that's, so those other three schedules simply show the benefits, their impact on the operating.
So thank you, Roland, very much. And thank you, Pete, for your, additional input and helpful input. So Jeff, I think, did you have questions? And shall we start with you?
Yeah, I had some comments as well, if I may.
You mean discussion? Why is that a better way? Jeff, do you have some discussion?
Yeah, that is that. I want to say at the outset, please appreciate that that Leslie and I are trying to participate, and we feel a little bit. I feel a little bit as if I'm looking at a process here that forecloses in large measure the proper full participation in the development of these guidelines. We received these guidelines from you on Tuesday, and at that point, actually, it was only after I had sent you an angry email the previous night pressing to receive guidelines when I understood that this special meeting was being set up for Thursday morning. It was my impression that the majority caucus has had these guidelines for quite a period of time. I think it goes back at least to the occasion when we gathered socially to wish Elaine well. That's almost 2 weeks ago. It really would be better if these guidelines would be shared more broadly so that others can participate. We're all elected to this board for that purpose. The way the schedule's set now, we received these guidelines on Tuesday, Thursday morning at 8:30 in the morning. We're holding a discussion that's time limited. And then Tuesday morning, after a 3-day holiday weekend, we're voting and bringing these things to a conclusion. And I think that's a giddy up that's not necessary. If you look back at some of the prior years, I'm looking particularly at 2012, when there were issues that were dividing the caucuses that were worthy of conversation. At that point, the first read was back on September 6th. We had a workshop on September 25th. We had another workshop on October 15th. And we didn't meet as a budget committee to vote on them until November 13th. We voted as a full BET on November 19th was a span of time of 2.5 months. That's a lot different than the under 1 week, which is what we're doing at this point. And I think that's a concern. We voted as a board, as a committee, to ask questions of the various departments for some factual backfill that we thought was necessary. I mean, actually, my purpose was more to actually meet with some of the departments and have a preliminary interview with them. But I acceded to the request from Deborah that we satisfy ourselves initially, at least, with some questions. At this point, we received responses to those questions. We prepared those questions and distributed them, not to all the departments, but to Public Works, Parks and Rec, Fire, Police, and Schools. And we got answers back at this point from police and then last night from schools, but we have no answers at this point from Public Works, Parks and Rec, or Fire. As was isolated in the conversations a few minutes ago, we're looking for some input from the town attorney on our exposure on the risk fund. And I had on my list Nathaniel Wither, although I heard it mentioned that Roland has had an in-depth conversation with Nathaniel Witherell and understands that the negative fund balance from last year will come in at 1 million. That was the piece of information I was looking for that I didn't realize that we had. I called Mrs. Tarkington immediately after receipt of the guidelines and went through in detail with her exactly where my concerns were going to be, both in the text of the guidelines as well as on this exhibit. And I think that's the interplay that we should be having as a full committee, not limited to a phone call and not sandwiched within a total time span of not quite 1 week. With those things said, I had some point-by-point concerns on Exhibit 1 that I'd like to go through, if I may, and request answers perhaps from Roland or whoever perhaps has proper answers. And the first one indeed is the risk fund. I'm remembering that when we met with the town attorney not 6 months ago, we asked him what seemed to be the aggregate exposure on the pending cases. At that point, we were talking about fiscal year 21, not fiscal year 22. But his assessment at that point, he came forward with a preliminary figure, but then rethought it and came back with a more final figure. And if my memory serves me correctly, he thought the exposure was about $4.4 million. We've moved, as the controller noted, to an insurance format that has a self-insured retainage of $3 million each case, that we're self-insurers for that sum. So I'm a little uncomfortable with the $2.35 million contribution to the risk fund in a setting in which we were doing quite well with a contribution of $3 million. We weren't building up some enormous unspent risk fund, and that was in years in which our self-insured retainage was a lot less. So I guess magically we're supposed to be making an assumption here that we're going to be sued less over the upcoming time span, and I just don't know there's a basis for that, although I'd like to hear what the town attorney has to say. Secondly, I'm concerned, as I said a year ago, I'm concerned with the concept of a subsidy planning on assumption that Nathaniel Witherell is going to function properly with a subsidy at just $1.5 million. For a long time, we were subsidizing them at $2.7 million and we're coming in with a negative fund balance at that. These have been difficult times. This particular year, when I think Roland is about to advise us the negative fund balance from the immediate past year is going to be $1 million. That'll be a year in which we receive some funding as a result of COVID from state and federal sources. And I think it makes the $1 million negative fund balance an artificial figure. And so my second point would be that I frankly would be recommending a $2.7 million subsidy to Nathaniel Witherell, not $1 million. Next, I'm concerned about the plan of funding the subsidy to the school lunch program at $150,000. We funded it in the past year at $300,000. In the year before that at $217,000, I believe, and at $348,000 the year before. These are figures which were our subsidy plus the accumulated negative fund balance that was achieved. This is a program in which, in large measure, we run at a deficit because of the service of free and reduced lunch meals for which the payment that we're receiving from the state and federal sources doesn't cover the true source, and accordingly it runs at a negative. If we've been running at the negative figures that I cited a moment ago, are we not just setting ourselves up for failure at 150,000? Or to put it more accurately, aren't we in a sense sort of fibbing to our citizens when we put out an expected budget which has components in it that we don't honestly think are going to be met? I have concern about the $40 million figure as the estimate of what our capital appropriation is going to be, meaning the total, not appropriation, but the total capital projects for the year. We, as a budget committee, just 6 months ago, put together a budget which had a capital program at $73 million, not quite. Just a tad under $73 million. Yes, okay, it was reduced down to, I think, $38 million under the COVID circumstances, pushing back a number of items. And those items included most of the money, not quite all, but most of the money for Hamel Rink, the funding for the renovation of Julian Curtis School, the orderly purchase on a sequence of an $800,000 fire pumper. You begin to disturb these orderly sequences, and you begin to cease to have this process of planning for the obsolescence of your equipment, and you begin to end up with a setting in which you have moribund equipment that begins not to serve you well. I'm concerned also about the artificiality of putting $3 million as a reduction under the capital tax levy. This is a use of fund balance in reduction of the mill rate. And just as we're putting the $1 million for Nathaniel Witherell's negative fund balance down with the use of fund balance for the funding, and just as we're putting the $520,000 for the school lunch program down there, this $3 million, if you wish to be pulling funds out of fund balance to pay down the mill rate, you ought to show it there, not as a negative item in the calculation of the capital tax levy. I think when you show it the way you're showing it here, there too, it's a little deceptive to the public who are looking to see exactly what are the tax dollars out of current taxation that are going into our capital expenditures. You're saying to them it's $45 million when in fact it's $48 million. And I like better the candor of it. Further on the $40 million figure, I mean, our capital plan was that we were going to be stepping up the cash contribution to our capital expenditures year by year. In fiscal year 20, we were going to be spending and did spend $53.8 million, nearly $54 million. For the current year that we're in right now, the plan was for that to step up by its usual $3 million to 56. And we artificially reduced that in light of COVID in the budget that was passed on a split vote. And for the upcoming year, by that normal sequencing, we would have been at 59.8, nearly $60 million. So to make our contribution to the capital tax levy at 48, or call it, if you seem to be preferring to call it $45 million, is in a sense an artificial reduction, which is a process of postponement of capital projects. Since we don't have a list of capital projects, it's hard for me to discuss with you which capital projects are being artificially postponed. But clearly there is a postponement of capital projects. You're going to find yourself in a posture where you begin to get back to the setting in which you're, for example, squeezing schools to do less capital maintenance and then begin to pay higher costs for the consequences of the capital maintenance. Just saying words to you like Hamilton Avenue or something ought to make a cold chill pass through you. But with that, my point to you is I have some problems with some of the items. The last remark I should make relates to the text. I'm certainly not going to put you through the pain of wanting to wordsmith with you the text of it. But if this is a collaborative process of 4 people on a budget committee, I would have to point out to you that there's at least 3 places where you make declarations on behalf of the committee, declarations on behalf of the full BET that I would not be willing to sign. I'm talking particularly about on page 2, where you say that the budget committee's objective is to produce a mill rate of 0. Your actual words are the budget committee's objective is to bring in the mill rate for fiscal year 22 near or below the current fiscal year 21 level. Then a couple of pages later, at page 5, talking about Nathaniel Witherell and the lunch fund, you're saying in the at the top of page 5, you're saying to those 2 departments, if I can call them that, that you want them to be making adjustments to bring them to a point where they are running at a break even. I don't think it's reasonable to you to expect that the school lunch fund serving free and reduced lunches to students is going to ever run at a break even, and it's just unreasonable to make that demand. So too, to say to Nathaniel Witherell, we expect you to run at a break even. I just don't think that's going to happen. And if you start to make those demands, you begin to undermine the proper respect that we want the departments to have for these guidelines. I want to limit myself to saying things to them that are reasonable and obtainable. The last sentence that it would be a difficulty for me would appear on page 6. It's actually 2 sentences. It reads, the BET recognizes that it may be preferable not to have an increase in the mill rate or in associated fees during the COVID-19 pandemic. The objective of the BET will be to support a mill rate near or below the fiscal year 21 mill rate level. The objective for me, I can't speak for anybody else, but the objective for me is not necessarily to produce a 0 increase in mill rate. The objective for me, as I sit on this committee, is to find a right balance back and forth between the services that this town should be providing and doing it in an efficient way, and balancing that against the affordability of those services. And that reaches a balance point. I recognize that's a political judgment. 4 people sitting on a committee may easily have 4 different views as to where that balance lies. But I can't sign, I can't support with a vote, is a better way for me to put it, guidelines that says that my objective was to produce a 0 increase in mill rate. I would like to achieve that, but my objective actually is to find a right balance between mill rate and the level of services. Thank you, Madam Chairman. Those are my remarks.
So thank you, Jeff, very much. I guess, I'd like to go to the others. I just didn't want to stop you because you were in a roll, but we hadn't really introduced the written guidelines yet. But so thank you for your comments on those too. I think I'm only going to make one comment at this point in time to what you've said here. And I thank you for encompassing, really everything. But I'd like to come back to your point on the transfer from the capital non-recurring fund balance. If I understood your point, and that you wanted that something like that elsewhere, you didn't think it was right to have it there in funding. But I think Roland should speak to that because he felt that was the right place from an accounting standpoint to put it, Jeff. So Roland, before we move on and ask the others if they have discussion, do you want to just address that one point? I just think it's important that at least we have an understanding of why it's there and not where you suggested, Jeff.
Well, Leslie, we did have it, if you remember, we had it down below for a while and then moved it back up.
Right, because you felt that was you said from a presentation accounting standpoint, it was better to put there. I just want to make sure that that Jeff understands it wasn't, I'm not sure what words he used there. I don't want to repeat them, but there was a sort of a accounting presentation reason for this because it relates to that particular fund and not the general fund, as I understand it. It relates to the correct?
Right. Yeah, it's coming from a different fund.
Right. So,
You know, recurring is just part of our fund balance. Up above, we're pointing out that there's an accumulated negative fund balance of 520,000 on school lunch, but we don't put the credit for the paying of it out of fund balance up there. We put it down where we show funding. And Roland is about to tell us in a little while that that he understands from Larry the accumulated negative fund balance from the current year at Nathaniel Witherell will be about $1 million. We don't put the credit up there under fixed charges. We put the payoff of that down below under funding. This $3 million is just reaching into fund balance to contribute. The contribution, you may be thinking in terms of the contribution as being applicable to capital. There's nothing about it that's applicable to capital. The capital is the capital. You came up with a list that leads to $48 million. And then you're adding $3 million to the use of fund balance. It happens to be coming out of capital non-recurring, but it's just fund balance, and it's being used to produce $3 million less at the bottom line. You're using $3 million to buy down the mill rate. That's fine. That's very appropriate. We got lots of fund balance, and I've been talking about using it for a long time. That was what I was saying to you in April and early May. I don't have a problem with the use of the fund balance. I just want you to be overt with the public of not have it appear in a myriad of little pieces scattered around the bookkeeping, but let's collect it in one place and show funding. Show that you're using 15 million, show that you're using $1 million, show that you're using 520, and show that you're using 3 million, group them all together. They're all uses of the fund balance to reduce mill rate, returning to the taxpayers some of the dollars that we accumulated from their taxation in prior years. We're having a rainy day. Let's go ahead and use it now.
Yeah, again, I only wanted to point out why it was there. So do we have some more discussion, Deborah? Or
I just want to
Leslie?
respond, if I may, just respond to some of Jeff's points. So Jeff, thank you so much for your comments. Just a few observations. This is my first time going through the guidelines. So, you know, on the risk fund, I think there the process is, there's an opportunity to have that conversation, and during the deliberations and at that time, I think now, you know, you put in like sort of your best guess, but that number will be finalized, as Pete referred to, based on the discussion with the audit committee and the lawyer actually presenting to us. So I think that that number is going to change, or may or may not change, but I think the process on that one is typically more as part of the budget. In terms of the school lunch fund, again, I think some of this is best guess of where we sit today. There's still a whole process that we're going to go through. If the school lunch fund needs more money, we're certainly going to have that conversation. In terms of capital, I think part of it is we're sitting on a substantial amount of open capital. I think COVID pushed a lot of it out. And so, yes, while we did cut back on some capital last year, it couldn't get done. And so I think one of the things we need to really look at with respect to capital is what really can be achieved in the upcoming year. And I think that should be, again, our discussion in the February meeting. And then another one on the capital non-recurring, I actually agree with you on the location of it. It was one of my suggestions, but it was presented that maybe this is the more technical, correct way to show it. But I think the capital non-recurring, those funds are more, I mean, they have more of a specific purpose to them than just the general fund. And I seem to recall last year we talked about whether or not we wanted to use capital non-recurring towards some of the capital. Again, something that we've been talking about, where we put it on the sheet, you know, if we need to move it, that's fine. Anyway, that's just kind of high level, just some reactions to some of the stuff. And in terms of your wording, you know, we look forward to, you know, seeing, you know, any potential changes that you would like to discuss. So thank you.
So I don't see Leslie here. Let me start with my comments, if I may.
Oh, I'm sorry. I am here. I am here, Leslie. Please proceed.
Okay, thank you. I want to start with the overarching comment that these guidelines as written are a departure from prior year guidelines. In prior years, we talked about the guidelines as being a a look at where we see the departments might be and at the time. However, we give the departments the latitude to develop their budgets and ask for what they need to ask for. We talk a lot in prior guidelines about service levels and meeting the service levels expected of our residents and trying to fund those. And as Jeff said before, the balance of what the cost of those services are versus what we're able to afford to provide. These guidelines drop any mention of service levels. I didn't see the word service anywhere in the guidelines. It also doesn't really give the departments guidance on or an expectation that we're willing to talk to them in February about any differences than the numbers they appear on this sheet. In fact, it says that this is the budget that would be approved today if we didn't know anything more. And I have to say, I wouldn't approve this budget. So I object to that sentence, as Jeff has also said he would object to. The key problems, there are a few issues in the operating budgets, though I recognize that there was certainly an understanding of the contracts that are signed and trying to meet the financial needs of those contracts, certainly the labor settlements, understanding that inflation is hitting our operating costs and should be reflected in the budget here, which wasn't reflected in our budget last year. But I do have a couple of comments on certain expense items that I think are missing from this particular budget. Capital concerns me incredibly. I think that this is setting the town on a path of underfunding maintenance, underfunding projects, and not giving us the ability to fund those in the future. Now, our look at a one-year budget makes it more difficult to really understand those longer term impacts, and that's where doing a debt model is going to be important. But dropping a capital tax levy by $6 million, that's not $6 million that we can recover easily in any given year if capital needs continue to increase, because that's directly on tax rates, and we know the pressure that we have to keep tax rates low. But that was a source of funds that were found in this particular financial exercise to lower the mill rate to a 1.46 that's shown on this chart. It's actually $9 million taken out of capital. Some of which, and I agree, the capital non-recurring is a source of funds, but we have to recognize that it's a one-time source. It's not something that we can continually do year after year, or that we can then start, if we end up needing those monies, we have to recognize we have to start taxing to get money back into that account. We no longer fund the majority of our projects by cash, so that any project that comes in under budget that is bonded no longer increases the capital non-recurring account. So we just have to find that right balance. But I am very concerned about capital. We have a number of, we have the school master plan, which has always been in discussion, but we do know that there are a couple of schools that have gone through a feasibility study, and those projects could not be funded with a $40 million cap on capital spending next year. And with a $45 million capital tax levy, that's the base for tax increases in following years. We've just made it that much harder to accomplish some of those projects. And also Eastern Greenwich Civic Center, Hamel Rink, stormwater projects. Some of those large ones are coming through with the Strickland Brook project, and Byram is on that task. I mean, I think we really have to look at capital in a longer term horizon. And I am concerned that the proposal here is going to hamper our efforts to go forward. Generally, those are the comments. More specifically on financials, I'm not sure, Leslie, how you want to do that, but the concerns I have on the operating budgets, Roland, if you can scroll up a little bit. So in the salaries regular account that you have the 0.56% increase, you explained it's because many of the labor settlements are coming in at zero, so that the base number in your estimation, which was a 0% increase last year, but that zero should have included or did include a 2% assumption for wage increases, and that 2% is typically encumbered. Once the labor settlements are completed, that encumbrance goes away, and so the departments have access to that 2%, which would have been allocated towards labor settlements. And if they start spending that when they go to next year where there is an increase in salaries, those funds, then they're caught short. That same logic applies to the salaries teachers and the Board of Ed salary budget. Again, as we know, we held it flat 0 last year. However, their contracts were a 2.9% increase for teachers, so they had to absorb that. That absorption was about $3 million, which was the $3 million that we talked about come in April, that if you didn't fund it for the Board of Ed, they are short $3 million, and they had to try to find it elsewhere. What they've done, and I think they've done an incredible job of trying to find those sources going into the year. They found about 600,000. That's a permanent reduction, but they are still believe that 2.5 million of expenses need to be funded again as they go forward. They're not permanent reductions, and so they are still short that wage increase, if you will, from teachers for the fiscal 21 number. So their base is too low going into next year, even increasing it to 3%. The special education increase, I think it's good to get it's not special education general expenses. We're talking about special education out of district tuition payments, which have been included in this budget at 1.6 million. I think we got information from the schools administration that that's really 1.9 million, which is what they would want to see in the budget. So that's a $300,000 gap. But we also know, and I think this board fully supported the special education study, which is just ongoing. I think the schools gave an update at their board meeting on Monday night this week. So that is beginning. There will be recommendations coming out of that study. Often they require some funding. We don't know what they are. The schools don't know what they are. But I'd like this board to consider how we want to handle that, because certainly it's in all of our interests to improve the service levels, to reduce the litigious nature that we have going on in that particular area, and improve our service levels just to do the right thing for those children. I think the bus contract increases is higher than the 2% reflected here. That's a $6.7 million expense for them. So it's not a small number when that's not fully escalated and recognized as a contract. Like I said, on the operating expenses in general, those are my comments there. But as I said, in the capital, I just want to go back. I know a lot stated about open capital and how large that is, and that we have a backlog. And when you look at the analysis of that open capital, let me just try and find the work that I did here. So open capital right now has $85 million of available funds. It has 21 million that I know Leslie likes to refer to of encumbered funds, because that still takes management to execute those projects. So about 105 million. I may be looking at a report a couple weeks earlier than you, but that's about the range of the number here. But the fiscal 21 projects, the ones that we just approved in July, that's $33 million of that. I think it's unrealistic to expect that this time of the year, they would have spent a lot of that money down. They have reduced it. It's already down 6 million from the 40 that was approved. So we've made progress, but I think we can fully expect that those would continue. So that, looking at I'm now adding total encumbrance and open available funds, that leaves 72 million in available capital. We know that several of our departments, DPW and the Board of Ed, now manage their capital with multi-year projects, right? Highways and the DPW projects often require appropriation years before they're able to spend the money, because they have to show to the state that there is funding from the local level before they get the reimbursement, and there is a lot of planning that goes into those projects. DPW highways, 12 million of that 72 million. In other DPW projects, construction projects, we do have some other large funds in there for things that are just slower moving. There's still money in there for Eastern Greenwich Civic Center and for Hamel. And, you know, there's a $200,000 project for Eastern Greenwich Civic Center's heating system, which they're not going to spend on that because they're going to be doing the building. So there are things hanging out there that are not projects that are active or that can be completed quickly. The Board of Ed has the biggest outstanding number at $23 million, but as this board knows, the Board of Ed shifted from a one-year kind of capital forecast to a two-year capital forecast model, in the sense that they do planning in 1 year and then they execute in other years. And they need to sign some of these contracts are large contracts, and it's not just completing it 1 year, it takes several years. They're limited by the school year and the ability to be in the buildings. And so I think we really need a good understanding of what they can and expect to accomplish. We certainly don't want to go back to the days where we're underfunding basic maintenance. And in that master plan and work on the Board of Ed facilities that was just done a few years ago, it said that maintenance capital on average should be in the $15 to $20 million range. So again, I look at a $40 million capital projects number here and a statement in the guidelines that say, this is the budget we would approve today if we had to vote on a budget today. It's totally, I think it's unrealistic. I think it doesn't, we need the input from the departments and a frank conversation about the timing of their spending and the timing of their signing contracts, because it's not just spending, it's when they have to commit to the funds. So, and then you look, as I said before, going forward as to some of the projects that are on the list. Are we really going to defer Eastern Greenwich Civic Center for another 5 years? Are we going to defer addressing the fact that meant at least the two projects that the Board of Ed's talking about and fixing buildings are ADA access for those buildings? So much longer are we going to continue to push those projects down the road? And if you don't start funding them this year, then you know that could just go on forever. We have, you know, two buildings, JC, and they will be acting, I believe, on the JC ed specs at their next meeting, the Board of Ed, and the work is far down the road on the Old Greenwich School ed specs. And so I think we have to be really thoughtful and careful and again, meet the expectations of the communities of what we should be providing. So from the financial chart, those are specifics. I think, again, to point out that there are financial maneuvers included in here, like getting $9 million from the capital dollar accounts to lower that mill rate, which we can't replicate in future year, puts us behind the 8 balls. It also, in all of the text, that's not really pointed out. People don't understand that when they look at these numbers, but they can't read about it in the text to understand what's going on to generate, I think, an artificially low mill rate for what we can do. At this time of year, we're typically just putting out a general guideline, not using those financial maneuvers that we have available to us in February, March, and April to come into a budget. We're telling, this purpose of the guidelines is to tell the departments what we need them to do. And this document is trying, it to me, it's giving the answer. It's not really starting the conversation. I have a lot of difficulties with the text language and with the expectations there. I don't know if you want me to go into those now or how you want to handle that, Leslie, but there's some things in here which I don't understand what the expectations are. I think that, you know, as Jeff pointed out, asking the school lunch fund to go to zero when we have the requirement and the obligation, and we should have the desire to help with the free and reduced lunch school program. We know that that is not fully funded by the federal government or the state government, and then we have to kick in. And so to expect that the rest of the program compensates for that cost, I think is a value judgment that we need to be discussing. So I'll stop there because I've been talking for a while, but like I said, there are things in here about consolidations. I don't understand what your process is or what you're expecting the departments to really be doing here. I think that there's centralized policies and leadership for building construction. Again, I don't know what you're expecting the departments in the town to do. You're talking about commonality of services and changes. And I get that we want to have the conversation over how we can operate smarter. And that's a good conversation to have. But these guidelines don't really set up the right, or don't indicate what the right process is for determining those things. They're difficult decisions to have. We've looked at a lot of these areas before. We should be building on what we learned before. And so I'm troubled by some of this language. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Leslie. I know Jeff has his hand up, so he would like to speak again. And so I'm calling on Jeff.
Yeah, actually, I had raised my hand before and spoken. I will speak again on a narrow thing, but I should wait to the end till after Deborah's had a chance to speak. My hand was up from earlier, from before I spoke the last time.
I'm sorry. I did.
Just got to take it down. But I would like to speak again, but not until after Deborah's had a chance to speak.
Okay. Deborah, do you have any comments at this point in time?
Yeah, I guess, again, for me, my first time going through the guideline process, I mean, I think, you raised a lot of questions, Leslie, that I think will come up in the February meetings, which I think is typical. I don't think we try to answer all those questions now when putting together the guidelines. I also do believe that last year's budget guideline did have a suggested or targeted overall mill rate that was different than what the spreadsheet, the estimate had shown. So I thought that was typical. I think that that's the way it was done last year when you had actually put together the guidelines. But I think all the questions on capital, my big question on capital is how much can we really do? And should we be proving things that, and I understand the point about the Board of Ed, and maybe they do need to budget in year one, even though they need to commit to it in year one in order to engage in it in year two. And we did also have that conversation last year. So we should have that conversation when we have the detailed capital to go through as part of the February deliberation. So I think you raised some interesting points. I look forward to those conversations in the budget hearings.
Can I just respond, just going back to last year's budget guidelines, because I have them in front of me. They show, just so you know, a mill rate of 4.68%. And then it shows the bottom line chart of what we might need to change to get it to a more palatable number. It didn't try to guess how we would get to a final budget number.
Thank you.
It actually goes further.
Thank you.
But my point was a different one, Leslie, though. It was the fact that there was the BT anticipates a mill rate increase in the range of. So my point was more that maybe you didn't talk about how you might get there. You did show an estimate that was higher than what, say, the range was. That was my point. So, but thank you for the clarification.
Jeff, did you have something?
Yeah, in every prior year when we've had something very analogous to Exhibit 1, which is it's what Roland is showing up on the screen, we've been careful to say in the guidelines that we're not setting out the budget here. We are showing a projection of what the dollar figures would be, assuming level services, and at some of the facts only partially known to us. It was carefully said as not being a proposed budget. It was said to be nothing more than a projection to help people understand what the dollar impacts are. In this guideline on page 2, it says that this is the estimated budget, and it'll be the starting place for our conversations in February. So it intends to be saying much more concretely, we're putting forward a budget here. Not just a projection to give an illustration, but this is a budget. I also think it's worth underscoring something, which is an easy mistake for a committee doing the work that we're doing to do. It's very easy at a high level to look back and say we have $106 million worth of appropriated but unspent capital, and we shouldn't be doing any capital projects until that money is spent. we're not so stupid in the process that we do each February to not ask the departments about that. In fact, we get from Roland a printout, item by item, line item by line item, year by year, of exactly what were the appropriations, what's spent, what's encumbered, and what's available. And the very first things that we ask each and every department that come before us tell us about this. And let me take this opportunity to underscore what Mrs. Moriarty just said by reminding you that although it is true, there are some items in that list every year with many or most or all, I don't know which of the departments, in which, yes, you're right, we could be doing some of that. For the great majority of it, they in detail explain to us this is a work in progress, or this is being held up for approvals from DEEP, or we're waiting for approval from the Army Corps of Engineers, et cetera. In each and every one of those items, for the vast majority of them, there are clear and specific reasons why there are appropriated sums outstanding but not yet spent. And so it is provocative to the public and a misstatement to the public to be throwing around to them that we're not spending more because we have $106 million of unspent capital for prior appropriations. That's not an accurate reflection of the true facts at all. Lastly,
before you,
I'm sorry. Let me make one final comment. In my private conversation with our committee chair, I did mention to the committee chair, actually I poked fun at Mrs. Tarkington, that although she has been the prime questioner on unspent capital, I was amused that requesting that the departments come forward with an explanation for each and every item of unspent capital appropriations, it didn't appear in this year's guidelines. It was just an oversight, but I did want to mention it'll be one of the changes that I'll be proposing. I didn't mention it in my comments earlier. I did mention it to Mrs. Tarkington in my conversation with her on Tuesday. That's all I have.
And I thank you, Jeff. You did mention that. And I just wanted to make one sort of update here. The amount of encumbrances and available budget for the town is 120 million, just so that we make sure that we have an accurate number there. And approximately $78 million of that is town projects, and approximately 42 is BOE. So I just wanted to, add that to your comments. Deborah, you have something to say?
Yeah, I just want to clarify something that Jeff said. When you talk, when you say people or sort of suggest that people are saying that there shouldn't be any new capital as long as there's outstanding capital. I'm not sure if that's what you were saying, but I want to be clear that is not what I was saying. What I'm saying is that we need to be mindful of the ability to execute on capital. And so it should be the amount of capital that we can do in a given year, taking into consideration the point that I think Ms. Moriarty made, which I think is a very fair point about maybe there are times where you actually have to commit to a project in year one, knowing that you're going to do part in year one and part in year two. And I'm certainly always willing to consider that. But I'm not saying that you shouldn't do any capital because there's outstanding capital. I'm just saying we need to be mindful about what can we realistically achieve. And COVID has hurt our ability. There's been certain projects that did not happen because of it, which is very unfortunate. But that was my point. So thank you.
Okay. So I just, I think we've gone into some detail on the actual written budget guidelines, but I just wanted to just go through very briefly. The way it's presented is really with an introduction. It gives some of the, we'll call it background in terms of what's happening around us with the state government, with our consumer price index and other things that we've all discussed, the number of Alice households we have, a number of people in Greenwich, and so there's some broad outline. The next section basically runs through the highlights of the estimates that Roland went through. The guidelines continue to go through methodically in the same format that we have in our estimate. And those are, the operations, a section on fixed charges, section on capital, section on funds, revenues and enterprise, a section on revenues, and finally the summary. So again, it's tracking, the estimate in the same, type of format. So we maybe finish our discussion if we ask Pete or Roland if they have any additional comments that they'd like to add.
I don't have anything to add.
Roland, do you have anything more to add?
No.
So where do we proceed? Where do
I'm
we
so- I'm
proceed
sorry.
from here?
Jeff-
What's going to be our
Jeff-
process?
I was just going to, suggest that, I think what we've done in the past, I mean, you've gone back to 2012. I just go back to even last year. We have a first read, and then, obviously we'd like to hear from you, and you, I think some comments have been brought up, and we want to hear your comments, what kind of, put in, I guess, in writing, any suggested changes. And we're all working together and would, if possible, would like to get these guidelines approved next week. I think Leslie and I have talked about it. This meeting was actually set up as a response to Leslie, because she thought it would be worthwhile for us to have 2 meetings in the budget committee. One, the first read, which this is, the other to basically discuss the guidelines, which will be done in our meeting scheduled, our regular monthly October meeting scheduled for next Tuesday at 11 o'clock. So, what can be done between now and then would be very helpful. I think it's a different kind of a budget year. We have to respect that there is, in the current fiscal year, the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic. And, we've certainly said here, which we really haven't talked about much today, that this, the impact of the COVID-19 during the fiscal year 22 budget cycle is unclear, but that the expectations is to return to a level of normal. So, to keep to this schedule, to allow the guidelines to be approved in the BET meeting, would, get these guidelines out to the departments as they're now budgeting. We know that the BOE is certainly doing it. We know that departments are working with Ben in terms of producing their capital budgets, their operating plans. We hope every department submits one of those. So we're doing this, and we hope to hear from the other departments, as you point out, Jeff, that haven't yet responded to the questions. So, again, if we can move this process along, I think it's to the advantage of the town and the Board of Education, and to keep to the schedule of discussion approval of the guidelines at the October meeting. And again, next Tuesday, the 13th. So I thank you.
Okay.
And I see Deborah has her hand raised.
Yeah, I just wanted to reinforce, I think it would be helpful to the town and the Board of Ed if we could approve these guidelines and have it behind us for the October meeting as everybody is going through and preparing their budgets. It's been hard, in a COVID world, not being able to physically get together and talk, so everything takes, unfortunately, a little bit longer. But I think it would be in the best interest, and I'm 100% behind getting this done prior to the full BET meeting and having it approved then in October.
Jeff?
Well, surely it is correct that it would be great if the departments, including the Board of Ed, would have guidelines before it with the work that they have very close at hand. Nevertheless, we are where we are. We have unanswered questions, etc. This draft guideline, for whatever it was worth, was attached to the agenda, was part of the call for this meeting, this special meeting. I'd have to check back, but I believe all the department heads, including the Board of Education, were on the distribution list. So irrespective of what we do at 11 o'clock on Tuesday morning, this first draft is already before the departments and is of some guidance to them whether or not we're able to achieve a vote at 11 o'clock on Tuesday morning. For me, 11 o'clock Tuesday morning is a mixed bag. I hate to create the budgeting process detriment to the departments by not having approved guidelines. On the other hand, I hate the idea of voting for guidelines or having a vote on guidelines that has the unanswered questions that we have and has some of the doubts and issues and frankly has the absence of dialogue that we've had in prior years. I've never known, I've been doing this for a little while, I've never known, all right, Leslie, I agree with you, you've been doing it longer, but not by much. Never have I seen us go from soup to nuts on a process in 6 days, which is fundamentally what we have here. I don't think that's appropriate. I don't think it has to be 2.5 months as it was in 2012, but somewhere between would have been better. Maybe, I mean, we'll talk about this on Tuesday morning, or maybe we'll talk about it before that. But maybe the answer is going to be that we'll need to do another special meeting, do the approval process. Let's see how the dialogue goes at 11 o'clock on Tuesday morning. I'm just telegraphing to you that I have misgivings about the telescoped time and about the lack of healthy dialogue, especially between the caucuses. I heard Deborah say in one of her remarks that she's just seeing the guidelines for the first time today. But I understand from Leslie, conversation with Leslie, that you had input previously. It was my impression that your caucuses met at least once 2 weeks ago, and maybe more than that. I just think there should have been more dialogue back and forth between the caucuses. I just don't think it's healthy. I think we got to a rough edge as a full BET at the end of April and the beginning of May. And I'm looking forward to helping contribute, if I can, to a climate in which we improve upon that and get back to having a healthy dialogue. I understand elections have consequences and that I'm...
Jeff, Jeff, I don't think we need this conversation.
Okay.
I think what we're here to do a business thing, and that is to have the first read of the budget guidelines. I think, I want to commend you for coming back so rapidly with your comments, which you've also repeated today. I think you're very well organized for this. I think Leslie is very familiar with the process. We've had dialogue earlier, much, in terms of the process, input or whatever. I think that let's see how it goes. I think that everyone's had an opportunity to present some discussion today. This, quite frankly, you refer to history, is probably the most that I've ever had or seen in a first read since I've been on the BET. So, I thank everyone for participating, all their information, and I look forward to anything else. And, we do want to work and do the best thing for our town departments across the board, whether it's operating or capital. And I would also say that, we're all operating, I'm going to repeat once again, in an unusual environment. We haven't had the opportunity much really to be physically together. We had one, you mentioned Elaine's event. May seem like forever since we've had Elaine, but it was only last week. And so, some of the timeframes we're talking about are really much shorter. And we have had a compressed cycle here on many fronts for many reasons. And rightfully, at our budget committee last month, you, Deborah, mentioned the need for more questioning, understanding of the COVID environment, and that process is also continuing. So I thank you all. There'll be a lot of work needed to be done over the next few days, as you point out. And I guess at this point, I would ask if there's a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Oh, I don't see any. Okay, Jeff?
So moved. I
Deborah,
moved to
you seconded?
Second.
Are those in favor?
Aye.
Okay, so I thank everyone, and I look forward to
15 minutes to spare, Jeff.
Thank you. I need every one of them. Thank you.
Bye.
I look forward to seeing you on Tuesday. Thank you.
you.